the reproducibility of the social learning literature with all of you. So I hope you can all hear me okay, but just interrupt me if
yeah, it's all perfect.
Okay, great. So I think everyone at this workshop would agree that reproducibility is an incredibly important scientific concept. It's received considerable attention across the scientific community over the last few years, and it's well accepted now as a standard for published research. But I guess we would all also agree that while reproducibility is really embraced in concept, it actually is still appears quite difficult both to quantify and to achieve in practice. And I found that there's a lot of variation in the estimates of reproducibility across scientific disciplines. So it ranges, in my experience, from anywhere between 20 and 80%. And some of this variation is because these projects focus on different aspects of reproducibility, such as data availability or results reproducibility. And these projects have also identified different factors or looked into the effect of different factors on reproducibility, from age of publication to journal data policies to the availability of analytical code. And so then a natural kind of question that I had was, to what extent is this variation between different fields also driven by differences in data and methods in researchers? When can we expect estimates from a different field to apply in our own fields, and how much variation is there really? So one issue is that there are many ways in which reproducibility can actually be defined. It can be defined quite generally, as in endeavoring to preserve the rights of others to reach independent conclusions about your data and work. It can be defined quite specifically, such as given a population, a hypothesis, experimental design, experimental data analysis plan and code, you get the same parameter estimates in a new analysis. And it can be somewhere in between or a bit different, as in an independent group can obtain the same result using artifacts which they develop completely independently. So then the question kind of was for me, what degree of reproducibility is actually relevant? What's practical and what's achievable? So can we actually reproduce exact parameter estimates using the same software, computing environment, random seed? Would we reproduce the same original database if we reperformed a data coding protocol? Would we infer the same results from a set of reported parameter estimates? And it seems sensible to me that the answers to these kinds of questions should depend a bit on the context. So the motivation for the project that I'm talking about now is was to begin to think about what a standard for reproducibility could look like in my field, which is evolutionary anthropology. And evolutionary anthropology lies somewhere at the intersection between ecology, biology, psychology, economics, demography, so the field is really like characterized by a range in data types and methodological approaches. And so we decided for a first goal to try to quantify the state of reproducibility in the field of evolutionary anthropology. And we decided to focus on a research literature as the unit of our analysis. And that's in contrast to previous studies that have kind of looked at a specific type of analysis or articles published in a particular journal, for example. So we settled on a research topic that we felt reflects this diversity in methods and approaches that we feel our field is characterized by, and that is the topic of social learning. So for anyone that isn't familiar, social learning research is essentially research about social behavior acquired through observation or imitation of others. And all that's really relevant to know is social learning research has a pretty deep publication history starting from the 1950s, 1960s, and empirical work is characterized by a wide variety of data types, including observational and experimental designs and non-human and human study species. So the details of the topic of social learning are not really relevant in this audience, but I want to make an important point, I think, that so the details of the topic are really important to the reproducer, and in that case, me. So when we perform a reproduction, something that we need to be aware of is that there is a trade-off between the effort put into a reproduction and the feasibility of that reproduction. So in other words, if we have like unlimited time, resources, skills, and knowledge, we might in principle be able to reproduce any result. So we might, fly across the world and scan paper data from the 90s and correspond at length with the original researchers. We could take a course in a different software. I mean, there's all the possibilities, but how reasonable are these things? And so what we suggested, or what we felt, is that to what extent an estimate of reproducibility is actually useful is dependent on how much effort was undertaken to reproduce results to begin with. So because the skill sets of a reasonable researcher can only really be defined in relation to a scholarly community, we think that any reproducibility effort should be defined in similar relative terms. So through my study, I attempted to remain conscious of the time, effort, and skill set a typical early career researcher in the evolutionary behavioral sciences might invest in a reanalysis. And this is with expectation to software and hardware and knowledge of theory and statistics. And this is kind of central to my definition of a reproduction. So to quantify the state of reproducibility in the social learning literature, I considered the staged conditional process by which the results of any paper can be reproduced. And so I assumed that to reproduce a paper successfully, we need access to data. So data needs to be available to attempt the reproduction. If that data is available, it needs to be useful. So it needs to be complete and coherent to use for reproduction. Analyses need to be repeatable. So published reports need to be adequately detailed to reconstruct the analysis. And reported results need to be consistent with the reproduced findings. And all of these things need to happen for us to successfully reproduce a paper. And each stage is conditional on the previous. So if data isn't available, it cannot be usable. And if the analyses are not repeatable, then the results can't be assessed for consistency. So in my study, we were particularly interested in the influence of age on data availability in subsequent stages. And that's because this is a pattern that's been found in similar fields like biology. And we were also really interested in the influence of different types of data on data availability. And that's just because of the diversity of methods that I mentioned. And so we expected that that experimental data might be easier to share than observational data because it's been generated in a specific format and it's maybe less likely to be reused by the experimenter. And we also expected that maybe human and non-human data might have different constraints on shareability because of different ethical considerations. So to characterize an overall rate of reproducibility, we estimated the proportions of papers at each of these stages. And to spell that out a little bit more, if we define A as the event that data is acquired, B is the event that data is understood, C is the event that analyses are understood, and D is the event that results agree, then we can define the event that the results of a paper reproduce as the joint event of these. And so then the probability that results reproduce, it can also be defined as the probability of the joint occurrence of these events. And we can decompose this into a series of conditional probabilities, which we can call P1, P2, P3, P4. And so this is what we tried to estimate through our analysis. P1, the probability data is acquired. P2, the probability data is understood given it's acquired. P3, the probability analyses are understood given data is acquired and understood. And P4, the probability that reproduced results agree with published findings, given that analyses are understood, data is understood, and data is acquired. So we use statistical models of the occurrences of papers at each stage in the model to estimate these probabilities. So we estimated P1, the probability that data is available with an exponential decay model. So here, the event that that data is available for a paper I is Bernoulli distributed outcome with probability P1. And this probability is a function of the alpha parameter, which is the probability of data recovery at age 0, and the lambda parameter, which is a proportional decline in data availability with increasing time since publication. And we allowed both these parameters to vary with the type of data included in a study, because we were interested in variation by different data types. And to estimate subsequent stages of reproducibility, we considered that a single paper can be decomposed into multiple results. And so we estimated a rate of success P for n results of a paper reproducing. And as in the previous stage, we considered the influence of age, and we also clustered on paper to model variation between different papers in the success of these stages. So our protocol to evaluate the proportions at each of these stages in the model was divided into 2 parts. So we first assessed data availability. And to do this, we sampled studies and we downloaded the study, and then we recorded some information on it. So we recorded a unique key, the DOI, the title, the year of publication, the journal the paper was published in, all the authors in the author list, and whether a supplement was available with the paper or not. And then we performed a search for materials. So we looked in the paper for a statement about the availability of materials, and we followed the link to an external repository if available, and downloaded materials. We also looked in supplementary materials even if there was no statement to indicate as such. And in this way, we downloaded materials for papers online. And then we emailed authors, informing them about our study and asking for code if data was available to us, or sometimes asking for data as well, if we would have preferred data in a different format. For example, sometimes the data was embedded in the PDF of an article and we might have preferred data in a tabular format. So in each case, we just tried to be reasonable about this. We emailed corresponding authors, or we emailed first authors if corresponding authors were not listed. If the research was really old, more than 4 years old, actually, we performed a brief Google search to look for a more recent email address for an author. And we sent a reminder about 5 weeks after an initial inquiry if we didn't receive any response. So at the end of this whole process, we were able to categorize each study as one of data available online, data available through direct correspondence, no information on data, and data inaccessible to the author during the time frame of the study or is lost. So to evaluate the reproducibility of results for papers which we had access to data for, we came up with this protocol where we identified results in the publication abstract. We decided to do this because it seemed like the most systematic way we could think of to decompose a particular paper into multiple results. We considered that abstract results listed in the publication abstract are most likely to be cited by subsequent work. So after doing this, I searched in the text for evidence for each result, and then I listed multiple lines of evidence for each result, identified, and then I just used all of the available material through the correspondence with authors in the article text, anything we found online, to recreate the evidence that I listed. I attempted all my reproductions in R, even if the original software was different. And I'll say a little bit more about this later, but because of this, I allowed non-exact numerical reproductions. I didn't expect to numerically reproduce any of the results that I attempted. So, there I have an example of this reproducibility protocol in a bit more detail on my GitHub, but just now, I think it would be useful to go through at least like a partial example to give you an idea of what this might have looked like in a bit more detail. So this is the abstract for the paper that I'm talking about now. I'm just going to read through a bit of it. So reproducibility is integral to science, difficult to achieve, resurveyed, blah, blah, no spoilers. The first result might be data was recovered online through direct data requests for 30% of this sample. So pretty simple, that would be the first result. Moreover, data recovery declines exponentially with time since publication, halving every 6 years and up to every 9 years for human experimental data. I would then consider this the second result. So like this, I just went through the abstract and identified for myself what looked like individual results. And I recorded all of this in a single RMD document for each publication that I evaluated. And in this way, I recorded the result, the evidence from the paper, and then I used a separate R script for each publication to try to process the data and to reproduce the analyses. And then I recorded in the RMD whether I was successful or not for each result that I listed. And in this way, I could then aggregate all of the results at the end into a table for analysis. So just to zoom in on what one of these RMD documents might have looked like. So I listed results, like I mentioned. So in this case, the first result that I talked about, data is available for 30% of the sample. I would search the text and find a note that corresponded to that. And then I would leave a note for myself. 167 out of 560 papers with data available. In the second case, I might find a lot more evidence that corresponds to that result. And so then I would list it, there's a figure, there's a table of parameter estimates, and there's some means and intervals reported in the text. I considered that a result was reproducible if I could produce at least one line of evidence to confirm that result. And this is just because, for some case I couldn't produce a figure because I just couldn't figure out how to plot it, but I could refit the model and reproduce the table parameter estimates. I decided that there was no way I could say that that result was not reproducible. So this is kind of the qualification that I made. And when I failed to reproduce results, I recorded where the point of failure was. And so in each case, I decided whether the point of failure was data unclear, analysis unclear, or results don't agree. So as an example, a lack of data clarity would have been in this case that the data was either missing or unclear for this result. So for the second result, if I didn't have access to information on the different types of data, I'm saying data so many times, but if I didn't have the, access on the different types of data in my publication, so that's human experimental, human observational, if I couldn't distinguish these, then I probably couldn't evaluate this result. So then I would consider data clarity to be the point of failure. I would consider analytical clarity the point of failure if I wasn't able to use the materials provided to reconstruct the analysis. And so in this case, I mentioned I used an exponential decay model. I might consider that this is not a standard model in my field. Maybe a logistic regression would be okay. So if the original STAN and R code wasn't provided and there wasn't sufficient detail about the priors, or the whole model wasn't spelled out in the supplement of the text, then I would be unable to re-implement it. And so I would consider the point of failure analytical clarity. And I considered the results not to match if I felt, or if I found that the reproduced result negated or reversed the effect stated. So in this case, for example, if the result states that the expected half-life for human experimental data is larger than for other data types. So if I found that it was smaller than any of the other data types, then I would consider it to not be reproducible. So what, applying this protocol, what we found is, so we sampled 560 publications published between 1955 and 2018, and this corresponded to 151 human experimental studies, 296 non-human experimental studies, 43 human observational studies, and 70 non-human observational studies. And we used a combination of Google Scholar and citation forward and backtracking to identify appropriate papers. We just scanned the titles and then the abstracts and results sections for suitability. We only didn't include studies if they were not empirical, so if they were review or theory papers, or if they weren't obviously on the topic social learning. And so a huge caveat of this is that we don't expect this sample to be comprehensive. It's not every single social learning paper ever published, but we do expect that it's representative. So if we look at the distribution of different data types in our sample, we see non-human experimental work, work in animal behavior and ecology is most common earlier in the 90s, and then human experimental and observational work becomes more common more recently. And we kind of believe this to be true in the literature. So what we found for a full sample of 560 papers is that we could access material online in the article, the supplement, or at an external repository in 62 cases. Of the remaining papers, we attempted to contact the author in 473 cases. We received a reply of some kind, asking for more information, for example, or informing us about why authors couldn't participate in 315 cases. And we received data for an additional 105 publications, 167 of our total sample. So that corresponds to about 30%. And we estimated a pretty steep decline of the probability of data recovery with time since publication. So here, the orange line plots the expected value and the dotted lines the interval. And the open circles plot the observed data. So that's the actual proportion of studies for that year for which we received data. And the size of points are scaled by the number of observations for that year. So this corresponds to a data half-life of about 5.7 years, which means that we can expect the probability of data recovery to reduce to half its current value within 5.7 years on average. And when we allowed this data half-life to vary by the type of study included, we found that human experimental data has a somewhat longer half-life than other data types. So to evaluate the reproducibility of results, we randomly sampled 40 of the 167 studies. And this is just simply because I couldn't possibly do 167 studies again. And we chose 40 as a compromise between feasibility and power. So I identified 111 results across these studies. It was anywhere between 3 and 6 results per study. And I successfully reproduced 73 out of 111 results, which is actually quite a lot. In each case, I recorded whether the failure was due to missing or incomprehensible data, due to overly complicated analyses, or because the reproduced result reversed or negated the effect reported in the text. And so in terms of our overall estimate of reproducibility, this corresponds to the probability of data acquiry of 30% across the sample. If we break it down into the different subsequent stages, I estimated the availability of the usability of data, given availability to be 87%, the analytical clarity given usability and availability of data to be 97%, and the results agreement to be conditional on availability of data, usability, and analytical clarity to be 96%. And this corresponds overall to a probability of reproduction of about 23%. So what this all boils down to is that given our sample of social learning work, the age distribution in our sample, our protocol, our sequential model of reproducibility, we can estimate that less than 1 in 4 reproduction attempts in evolutionary anthropology will succeed. And what this kind of, well, so then the question is, what does this really mean for thinking about a standard for reproducibility of evolutionary anthropology? And what I want to talk about now is some of our results in light of some of the considerations I posed at the start about practicality and achievability of reproducibility, and also what our findings about the barriers to reproducibility might imply for our field. And so the first thing is that, we find almost no data is available for work published before the year 2000. And if we believe that this sample approximates the field in general, then it kind of suggests that much early work in our field is essentially lost. And that's pretty concerning. But at the same time, I like to interpret our results as kind of positive, because we also estimate that the availability of data in 2018 is as much as 8 times as for the year 2000. And this is really encouraging. So it seems, or it could be that, the increased importance of data posterity, the lower costs of data archiving, so it's not so much of an issue where I should put my data and how I should put it there anymore. And the spreading norms around open science and data sharing. So we might expect that a similar study many years from now would just show a really different decay pattern than we estimate. And in fact, we interpret our result that the reproducibility, that the data half-life of human experimental data is somewhat slower than other data types, to be indicative of an earlier adoption of maybe open science norms in the field of psychology. And maybe some people are familiar with the fact that the replication crisis has also been called the credibility revolution. So if we're to believe that data availability won't pose so much of a problem for studies published today or in the future, then we have to consider subsequent stages, so data usability. And I estimate it's about 80%, only 80% of 87% of data when available is actually usable, and I think this is somewhat concerning. And I failed to use the data when it was basically partially missing or missing, mostly missing, or when it didn't sufficiently correspond to the results reported in the text. And in this case, data documentation is really important. And all of us here are kind of aware that this is a huge threat to reproducibility. It's just a fact that many versions of the data exist before the version that we use for analyses. And just to kind of reflect that, I've included a couple of quotes from researchers that we corresponded with during our study. So somebody wrote, "I can't 100% remember which of the variables in my regression model I transformed and which transformation I applied." And somebody else wrote, "I did tons of versions of this study with different researchers testing different hypotheses with different designs and different covariates." And so although this isn't ideal, this is a reality in our field. And what I kind of suggest is that data provided can actually be too raw or, of course, too processed to reevaluate results in a paper. And while completely raw data is a gold standard, we should archive the whole history of our data online and make it publicly available. Sometimes this isn't feasible because of ethical constraints and sometimes because of size constraints. But essentially, I feel that for the purposes of reproducing published analyses, raw data is unusable unless it's provided with open source script to transform it to process data. And in that case, the process, if that's not the case, then the process data has to be provided in addition. And data can, of course, be true processed. So if it's aggregated into groups or a summary of the data, if it's not on the level of the individual observations in the paper, it also can't be used to reconstruct results. And so I suggest that maybe a somewhat intermediate stage of anonymized individual level data documented to correspond to the analyses in a paper should be a standard for including data with published analyses. So when I failed to reproduce results because of novel or complicated analyses, I had access to code for 11 of the 40 studies that I evaluated. And I found that even when it was non-functional, code was really useful. So most of the time it actually was non-functional, and it needed some tweaking to get going, but it's still really useful to clarify variable exclusion, transformation, things that are too detailed, obviously, to put into even a supplement. But at the same time, I want to raise the point that code, I don't believe that code is necessary to reproduce all results if we think about individual results. And that's because, at least in my field, empirical results can be of two types. They can be descriptive or they can be inferential. So a descriptive result might be, we recovered data for 167 of 560 publications. And an inferential result involves some kind of statistical modeling of the data. So something like we estimated a half-life of 5.7 years for data recovery. And inferential results obviously maybe demand more documentation for analyses. And this doesn't mean that they're less reproducible in general. It just means that they require more attention. And it's just a simple question of, would we expect a reasonable researcher to be able to perform a t-test or a linear regression if the data are complete and coherent? Probably yes, but would we expect them to design a novel statistical implementation of some novel theory? Probably not, without access to the original code. And so it's just a simple kind of consideration that all materials should be documented, or at least analysis materials should be documented with the reasonable researcher in mind. So one thing that we didn't do in our study that I was interested in is variation in reproducibility by the researchers themselves. So we didn't consider the effect of individual authors on whether data was recovered or results were reproduced. And this is obviously a huge consideration, and I believe drives quite a lot of the variation in reproducibility that we see generally and definitely in our sample. But our goal with this whole project is just certainly not to name and shame. So it's not really about who the individual researchers are. It's kind of a question of, oh, well, what I'm interested in is how different collaboration networks might positively impact reproducibility in the discipline over time. And so what a future avenue for our data is to kind of think about how we can develop a more network-based model or approach to assessing reproducibility in our sample. And so I wanted to give this question a little bit more color, read some of the responses that we got to emails in our survey. But before I do, I just wanted to say that in general, it was overwhelmingly positive. So people were really encouraging in our field about our project, but this is just kind of the range. So somebody wrote, there's no code, scripting, or paper data still in existence. This does not mean that the results are in any way valid. I do not agree with the focus of your project. Someone else wrote, looking at studies done even just a few years ago, i.e. published 2015 or earlier, is completely counterproductive. And someone just said, I don't see the point here really. And something in between was something like, at the time it wasn't customary to attach raw data or to put them in a repository. And something a bit sweeter was, I would also like to take this opportunity to thank you for highlighting the importance of careful documentation. I thought this would be a quick and simple job, but this process has taught me about a number of ways in which I can be a better scientist, so thank you. Yeah, so in sum, we found quite a low rate of reproducibility for the field of evolutionary anthropology, but this is largely driven by the unavailability of older data in our sample. And so to facilitate better results reproducibility, I would consider that making the link between the materials provided and the results reported in the text is kind of an important thing to do. And I believe, considering whether your materials pass a reasonable researcher test is good consideration to have in mind. And I also want to point out again that a model for evaluating reproducibility, so that's considering these these conditional stages is kind of the generative process by which we believe results to be reproduced. So keeping that in mind is probably useful when documenting materials for published analyses. And so we don't assess in any way inferential or data reproducibility, such as like when we ourselves would have made a different conclusion from the reported result, or whether reperforming the data coding protocol described would have produced a different database. But what I evaluate and what I'm kind of suggesting is that this type of results reproducibility for published analyses is just a first step towards preserving the rights of others to reach independent conclusions about our work. So I'm going to stop there and just thank my collaborators on this project. So my supervisor, Brett Beheim, and my collaborators at the Institute, Richard, Cody, Silke, Claudia, Leonie, Christina, Anna, and Anna, who helped me manage the database and gave me advice and statistical stuff. So as Rowan mentioned at the start, I've published a preprint on this work. It's online on SciArchive, and all the data and code to reproduce the results in that paper and some of the stuff that I showed you today is available at my Git repository. So, please have a look at it and get in touch with me if you have any feedback. And I'm going to open the floor to questions now, if anyone has any.
Thanks so much, Riana. That was amazing. And so my PhD is in economic history, and I used to think that I did a lot of data drudgery for my PhD, but you just put me to shame. That's just the amount of work that you've done is just incredible there. And can folks just add any questions that they want? I'll try and note them in if it's in the Slack or in the Zoom chat. But I'd just like to start a little bit more about this reasonable researcher. I took one course in law as an undergraduate, and it reminds me of the reasonable sort of person test or something like that with the juries and things like that. Is this like a concept that you've come up with? Is this something that you'd be exploring a little bit more? Like what does the reasonable researcher look like?
So, I mean, it's really, I guess I kind of thought of myself as the reasonable researcher. I was just thinking, what would a typical young is not the right word, early career researcher in the field know about? What would they want to know? And how would they be able to use their knowledge to put the information that you provide to them when they read your study to use? And I think this is I don't actually know so much about the criteria and law, so I can't specifically compare it. But for me, this was just really about thinking about our papers as advertising, the materials behind them, and how could we document that better for non experts in the field, so students, early career scientists. Yeah.
I'll just go through some of the questions in the chat. So Irma asks, how do you measure understanding?
Understanding. Sorry, I'm not
sure. Yeah, I wasn't sure. I was hoping that you were. I'm not sure. Maybe you could just add a little bit more context to understanding, and then we'll come back to this one. Okay. Then HP asks, what should one do if they have the data which a paper used, but end up getting completely different results to the paper? You must have experienced this in a few of your.
Yes. So I would say I didn't actually end up getting completely different results like that. So because of thinking about it in this stage process, is the data usable? Can I repeat the analyses as they've been described? I feel like it would have failed at an earlier stage. So if the data just wasn't comprehensible, I wouldn't have tried to repeat an analysis described. I would have just said that the data is not comprehensible. So most of the time, I just, if the result didn't reproduce, it was simply just that the effect, the effect stated in the paper disappeared. So if they said, I always went with the level of detail reported in the paper. So if the level reported was significance, the significance disappeared. Or if it was the effect size, a comparison of the effect sizes, then the direction was reversed. So, yeah.
Irma's just clarified the U in the formula, maybe.
The U in the formula. Okay, let me go back to the presentation. I don't remember the U. I wonder if it's the exponential, the first formula, or the. I want to clarify whether this is the formula for the statistical estimation of P1 or the subsequent stages, or if this is the derivation of the conditional probabilities from the joint probability. I'm not sure I see a U in any of the formula. Would it help if I shared my screen again and put the...
Yeah, let's try that.
Okay. So, I wonder if it's...
Maybe towards the top, was there? No.
Maybe it's the
Could it be the C? Oh, the V, maybe? Yeah.
Well, that represents the number of years since publication. So I just did 2018 minus the year of publication.
Previous. I'm just clarifying in the chat that it's the previous. So the U. Perhaps it's the C, analysis understood. Is that what you're talking about? The B, okay, data understood. Okay.
Data understood. Yeah, okay, so this is just a short way of me evaluating the clarity of the data. So it was either the data was missing for that result or the data was incomprehensible. Actually, I put an example of what incomprehensible data look like in my evaluations. One of them is that somebody sent me field data for 6 years of study, and only 1 year corresponded to the paper. And it was just, it seemed like a huge amount of work for me to navigate these files and to try to understand where the data that corresponded to the publication actually was. And in another case, I received Excel files with a lot of like duplicately labeled sheets. And this is not, these are really bad examples, but some of the results that I reproduced, I also had some data that wasn't that comprehensible. But sometimes you can work with it, and sometimes you can't, and that's where I bring the reasonable researcher into it. You would expect a scientist to do a little bit of work to try to figure out what the data might correspond to, even if there's not a data dictionary. But sometimes it's just not possible because there's too many tables, there's too much unexplained information for you to work with. I want to try to explain that better. So it would definitely depend. In most cases, the data was incomprehensible for all the results, but there was one case in which the data was incomprehensible because sometimes the data can be missing for specific results. So in some cases, an author deposits data for a publication, and the publication includes 2 experiments, but there's data available only for a single experiment. And so then you can only evaluate part of the paper for reproducibility.
Yeah, I think that's certainly clarified things. Hannah asks, were there any sort of systematic problems that made understanding the data difficult?
The systematic problems. It's only 40 studies, so it's hard for me to say if there's something systematic, but I did find that when the data was provided as in a CSV format, I can't quantitatively test this, but I have a feeling that when it was a CSV and it was in a long format, individual observations, it was just easier for me to use, even if there was no data dictionary. When it was an Excel file with multiple sheets, I could still use it sometimes, but sometimes it would, like in that example, it was really hard because there was things on top of the data. So yeah, I would say, you know, the format definitely made a little bit of a difference, but that's probably related to other things that researcher does.
Yeah, I think, yeah, exactly. I wonder if it's systematically sort of related. People who put their data in tidy CSVs are different to folks that use Excel files. But if anyone else has any other questions, just put them in the chat. But I was wondering if I could ask a more personal question. I mean, were you sort of concerned about undertaking this process? Potentially you're sort of taking down some big names in the field. And I mean, I don't know where you are on the tenure sort of situation, but, you know, jobs and things are concerning.
So definitely, it was a really big, at some point I kind of thought about the fact that I considered stopping, you know, I was kind of like, what have I studied? What have I got myself into? But I had really good support from my advisor and from, you know, really everyone that I work with at my institute, because a big aspect of what we do there is to think about, to really grapple with these problems and to think about them quantitatively, which is why I did this whole estimation thing. I guess, I just had to go with being reassured from the people in my immediate network. But it was pretty demoralizing because of some of the, you know, I showed you some of those emails. Some of the emails were pretty unfriendly, and I think that there are cohort effects here. So, you know, obviously the norms around data sharing have changed over time. And so I just kind of reassured myself that maybe things are changing and it's an okay time to embark on a project like this.
Yeah, well, I mean, we're certainly hiring in Toronto, so you should always apply for our jobs.
Yeah, that's good. I'm just making a list, you know, of places that accept open. Well, it's expanding. I think it's really changing. So, yeah.
Quite right. Yeah, exactly.
But
If anyone else, oh, sorry.
Sorry, no, I mean, I might share a little bit more information about that. So we had a couple of requests to actually share the original reproducibility reports for all of the studies that we surveyed. And this is something that we explicitly decided not to do because we informed authors when we wrote to them that they would remain anonymous in our study entirely. And so even though I share the full sample of studies, the data that I share to reproduce results is anonymized. So if someone really wanted to do the work, I guess they could kind of cross-tabulate. But the point is, I really didn't want to focus on identifying specific people. It was really thinking about patterns in the field. Yeah.
Yeah, that's it's a fine line, right? That it's a tough needle to thread, or whatever that you're trying to walk there.
Yeah.
If anyone else has any other questions, then please add them into the chat. Otherwise, I'm sort of interested a little bit more in your burden of proof idea, and to what extent you accepted it as reasonable. So if you could get within 5% of their results, is that sort of reasonable? If you could get within 50% of their results, is that, did that evolve as you went through your project?
So when I started the project, so when I started evaluating results, I had this idea that I couldn't possibly come up with a quantitative threshold. So I just decided beforehand, it wouldn't be fair for me to decide, 20% of, because of what, you know, in some studies, they just said significant p-value. So in some studies, so I could have made like a really detailed protocol for accepting or rejecting the results, but I didn't, actually, and having done this now, I would say, you know, that was kind of like a pilot to do so. So I didn't have that many results that I had to reject because a lot of the data dropped out, and a lot of, as you saw, the barriers were earlier than the results consistency. But I think the problem there was just really the sample of studies is so diverse in methods. I would feel more confident about coming up with what a quantitative threshold should look like for a specific type of analysis, if that makes sense. So yeah, that's something I think an in-depth evaluation of specifically the results consistency given all of the previous stages should look at. So
yeah. Harlan in the Slack asks, so would this study be replicable, or reproducible? How do you classify your own study?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and I don't know if it would be replicable. I guess it's the project started because I wondered about how replicable some of the findings in other fields were. So in biology and psychology. So this was kind of like, okay, what does it look like in my field? So yeah, I don't know how it would look in a different field. I also don't know how it would look for a different sample in evolutionary anthropology. If I was to make a guess, I would want to think about where that sample would lie within the observational, experimental, human, non-human categories a little bit. And in terms of reproducible, I think that it would. So it's definitely reproducible by my criteria. So the published results correspond to the data provided. So I think if I evaluated it in the way that I define reproducibility, yes, it would be reproducible. And this is why I posed this well, I tried to mention that I don't know, it's not, the data may not be reproducible. So if somebody else evaluated those 40 studies, maybe you'd have, so I should say everything was evaluated by me and by my collaborator. So at least had two sets of reasonable eyes on it. So yeah, I can't 100%, I can't say that it would be quantitatively reproducible, but I would suggest that you would find the same drop off, so the same barriers to reproduce. So I think it would be robust in the sense that, you find the same large barriers to reproducibility. Yeah.
Are you
But
going
also, sorry, and the way that my workflow is entirely reproducible. So it would be very easy for me to apply, well, except for well, no, there's like there's obviously some manual decisions to make, but once those are made, it would be really easy to regenerate the database, yeah.
And just finally, do you think you're going to do, are you going to stick with this sort of work, or are you going to go back to doing pure anthropology or this meta sort of work?
Yeah, it's a good question. I really enjoyed doing this work, but the motivations were kind of selfish. It's kind of just because I wanted to think about how I can try to make my work more reproducible. I learned a lot. I hope to learn a lot about different methods in the field, because because my kind of basic idea is that when you reproduce an analysis, then you learn how to implement it yourself. I did find that I didn't often reproduce analyses that I necessarily wanted to learn, because the materials so for the analyses that were complicated, that I would have liked to learn, the materials were not sufficient to reproduce them, which is kind of sad. So yeah, I'm not sure. There's definitely there's definitely a few things that I want to do with the data that I've collected now. So I want to create a database of reproducible social learning work, and I also want to do this kind of network-based analysis of the norms of reproducibility in the sample. But I'm not sure if I'll stay in meta science beyond this sample. Yeah.
Yeah, it would be the network effect would be super interesting. It'd be interesting to see if there's some group that is training students who then go out and do things in an appropriate way.
Yeah, I think it would be pretty important also just to, justify the workshop that we're at now, or to justify these kinds of things in general, to demonstrate these effects. But, yeah.
Thank you so much for your presentation. Fantastic paper, and hope it gets published highly. And thank you very